Brazil's President Jair Bolsanaro is up for re-election on October 2nd against former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in what many view as a defining moment for the country. While polls suggest that Lula is in the lead, some fear that Bolsonaro might not accept defeat. What will this mean for Brazil's democracy? And what would a new Lula presidency look like for Brazil? We'll ask Brazil's former Minister of Foreign Affairs and current advisor to Lula's campaign, Celso Amorim, in an UpFront special. Celso Amorim, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
Brazil's elections are coming up on October 2nd, and it is between former President Lula da Silva, who is currently leading the polls against incumbent Jair Bolsanaro. And earlier this month, a Bolsonaro supporter stabbed to death a Lula supporter. And on Brazil's Independence Day, Bolsonaro called the election a fight between good and evil. Meanwhile, at a recent debate, Lula accused Bolsonaro of, quote, destroying the country. Even if Lula wins the election, millions of people will have voted for Bolsonaro. Given this level of polarization, how does the country move forward?
Well, it's a complicated matter to explain in few words. I've been, I'm a career diplomat, so I lived for 60 years with different governments. Bolsonaro is something totally out of the map, out of the curve, as we say here in Brazil. He's anti-civilization, he's anti-culture, anti-everything that you identify with the modern, rational politics. I mean, I have gone through many other elections. This is certainly the most dramatic one we're living in Brazil, because after a long time in which also Lula was the victim of some sort of lawfare, persecution, or whatever, we are now, all the democratic forces are supporting Lula. Yeah, we had recently even a meeting with all the rivals. The former rivals of the PT are all of them who are rational people supporting Lula. It's only the extreme right that supports Bolsonaro.
What do you do when you have people, as you say, who are strong supporters of the PT, the Workers' Party? You also have people on the other side who are taking a very different position. Even if Bolsonaro loses, there will be a lot of unhappy people. There will be a lot of unsatisfied people. This election, as you pointed out, is the most dramatic in years, if not ever. How does the country move forward when there's such a big divide between the people?
Well, I think Lula was able to construct a big alliance, which includes many people. Lula is more a kind of a social democrat, left-wing, maybe by your standards. But he built an alliance. The man in his ticket as vice president was his former rival. So how we'll deal with that? With education, with patience, with dialogue. I think a lot of people are just manipulated by the Bolsonaro. It will be a difficult time, as it is in the United States. You can ask the same question about Trumpism there in the United States. But anyway, I think and we see what's happening in Italy. So that's why the elections in Brazil are so important, because it's not an election between right and left, as if it were the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in the UK. It's or something equivalent in Germany or whatever. It's an election between everything that represents the civilized norms of living, and including in relation to climate change, to the forest, to the human rights, and people who are on the other side, on the opposite side. They want to destroy not the left wing, not the legacy of Lula. They want to destroy, and they are destroying the legacy of 100 years of Brazilian Republic, more than 100 years. They are destroying all the legacy of the constitution that was established 40 years ago. So it's something very special, and we hope that with patience, with the way that Lula works, which is a very conciliatory one with those that want to dialogue, to discuss, and to discuss rationally, I think will reestablish democracy as it should be.
With Lula leading the polls ahead of Brazil's election, President Bolsonaro is already laying the groundwork to declare the election results fraudulent. He's publicly questioning the reliability of the elections, particularly Brazil's electronic voting system. And the last time Lula attempted to run for president in 2018, he was sent to prison by a judge who was eventually found to be biased by the country's Supreme Court. The charges were annulled, but nevertheless, the point remains. Do you worry what happens if Bolsonaro does not accept the results of the election?
I don't think this can happen. He can make a lot of trouble. Some of his people who are very fanatic ones. It happened in the United States with the Capitol Hill episode, but I don't think this would prevail. Coup d'etats in Brazil, especially right-wing coup d'etats, which are the only ones that we had actually, right-wing coup d'etats only are successful when they have the support of the economic elite, of the big media, and to a large extent of foreign countries as well. And in this case, Bolsonaro won't have any of them. Well, so I don't think there may be turbulence, but I don't think it would be successful.
The other thing you need is support of the military. Since Bolsonaro came to power, he has tripled the number of military personnel in key civilian posts to more than 1,000. His running mate is a former general who, like Bolsonaro, has praised Brazil's military dictatorship. So if Bolsonaro doesn't accept the election, what role does the military play? This seems like it could be another piece of a potential crisis here.
Well, I was Minister of Defense in Brazil, so I know them rather well. And it's one thing what people who are already retired or who are co-opted for politics, like many ministers who actually came from the military ranks, and the other thing is what the high command of the military tend to do. I believe they will be legalistic, that they won't go into an adventure that will isolate them, not only in Brazil, but in the world. So I don't think I think the military will uphold the results of the election, especially as if we hope and we are clear, we believe it will happen, if there is an immediate recognition of the election in Brazil.
Okay, fair enough. Let's pivot to the economy a bit. Lula has argued that it's time to put the poor in the budget and that it's time to tax the rich. Yet there's been talk that he might appoint his center-right running mate, Geraldo Alckmin, to be finance minister. In the past, Alckmin has supported privatizing Brazil's state-run oil economy, and he's presided over the violent eviction of thousands of families from the Pinheirinho settlement while he was governor of Sao Paulo. Is this potential decision a signal that Lula might be moving away from the left-wing policies of his last presidency?
Not at all. I mean, mind you, even in his last presidency, I mean, it was not so obvious maybe with this, before the election. But many of the ministers that he appointed cannot be considered left-wing. I think, of course, Lula is someone who is very careful with not spending it more than it is possible, but at the same time, he will not relinquish in his firm determination to help the poor and to help those who have been discriminated all these years. Poor people, women, black people. You know, Brazil has the largest Afro-descendant population in the world, second only to Nigeria, much bigger than the United States, for instance. So I think all these people support Lula and support his government.
Right, but the question, sir, isn't the support. The question is he moving further to the center or center-right even if you're establishing your potential presidency with people whose economic policies and disposition toward the poor is not in line with left-wing policies?
Well, let me say, it's not, Lula didn't move to the center or to the center-right. I would say the center-right moved to the center or to the center-left. That's what happened because of the madness that the Bolsonaro government represented. So I think
No, but,
in
but sir,
essence,
evicting families in Pinheirinho, privatizing the economic the oil industry. These are neoliberal and in some ways just violent moves. These are not just a response to Bolsonaro. These are problematic on their own. No.
oh, that was what you are referring to, the deposit of the people who were put out from the land they occupied, right?
Yeah.
So this was one episode. We would not agree with that at the time, and we will not agree. So, but I think Lula is the ultimate leader and judge. But I have a very confident appreciation of Alckmin, and I think he's very identified with the whole program, and he has been saying and repeating that Lula is the most popular leader and the one that really represents the people. So I don't think we'll have any problem in this front. Of course, economic problems we may have, because the economy is not for the world after the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions, the price of oil. All these things are big problems. And of course, in our own case, we have the deforestation that Bolsonaro allowed, permitted, sometimes even incentivized. So there are many problems. I'm not denying that. But I think we have a platform which is more center-left, which will require conciliation sometimes. That happened in the past. I'm not at all astonished with that.
So I won't belabor the point, but someone argue it's not even conciliation at this point if you're going into a potential administration choosing people who are to the right of your economic policies. But I want to talk about corruption for a minute. Lula has promised to crack down on corruption if elected, and he made similar promises in the past. But his party, the Workers' Party, or PT, isn't immune to corruption itself. In 2005, while Lula was in power, there was a major corruption scandal in which high-ranking politicians from the PT were convicted of bribing members of Congress to gain political support using public funds. Lula's former chief of staff was among those convicted, as well as the former head of the party. How do you uphold Lula's promises?
Corruption is a...
How do we make sure that the corruption doesn't happen again?
Well, all the instruments to combat corruption in Brazil, or at least the most efficient one, were created during Lula's administration. So the freedom with which the federal police, which is the equivalent to FBI, acts without following political orientation from the government. Many other aspects in the opening, the transparency law, and I could quote a great number of laws. These were created during Lula's government.
I think that's part of the concern for me, sir, is that during the time when this stuff is being established, his very party was engaged in corruption, and members of his staff, his former chief of staff, was engaged. So it seems to me that it's possible for him to have a vigilant attitude toward this stuff, and we still see corruption.
I don't think the corruption problem in Brazil was bigger than in any other country, including developed countries in which I have lived as a diplomat. I think a lot of what was called corruption was what you call pork and barrel, something like that. There was corruption, of course, but this was not particular to the PT at all. It has come from a long time, and it has to do a lot with, as I said, with the electoral system, which makes our elections very, very expensive. Mostly the elections for representatives, for Congress people. So I think this will continue looking at that with transparency and supporting the instruments like the federal police, like an independent judiciary, an independent. For instance, in your case, in the case of the United States, the man who would be called the Attorney General is a political appointee. In our case, it's not. He's independent. So I think this also has a great importance in improving what happened in the past. I think it went too far, and they transformed. Let us say, what was correct. Of course, corruption is something that you see, you have to combat, and it may come always again. So, but the instruments are there. Lula has always supported these instruments, and they will prevent serious cases of corruption to appear again.
Let's talk about the environment a bit. Brazil is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, meaning that Brazil's environmental policy could really be a game changer for the world. And while Lula has been praised for reducing the rate of Amazon deforestation during his time in office, he also supported major infrastructure projects, including the Belo Monte hydroelectric dam, which displaced somewhere around 40,000 people and tripled greenhouse gas emissions in the eastern region. How can you ask people who are affected by those projects to trust Lula again?
Well, let me say, first of all, that although I'm not saying that everything was perfect, there are conflicts between social forces in the country. But during Lula's government, the rate of deforestation, Lula and Dilma's government, the rate of deforestation diminished dramatically.
Absolutely.
Dramatically. And it increased even if the economy was growing. So it was not, there was an adequate. What I would say, as I said, as a career diplomat and foreign minister and so on, is that the consciousness in relation to the climate problem nowadays is even bigger. So the preoccupation with ensuring that we are not emitting carbon is much bigger now. This will be in the center of the idea of a green development, as you call it there in the United States, and we call too. So a green development then is present. So I think that the idea of stopping deforestation and having a kind of sustainable development.
But deforestation, respectfully, deforestation isn't in question right now. Will we reasonably expect more major infrastructure projects, more displacement of people? These are things that happened before. Why should we believe they won't happen again?
Because I think the consciousness on that question is bigger. I mean, if you listen to Lula's interviews, including the one with the foreign press that he gave, a collective one, you'll see that climate change became a central concern, which was not as central as it is now. Lula has even mentioned that he will create a ministry to be headed by an indigenous person. So this will be much more central in the politics. This is a societal change in Brazil also, which is very important. I mean, Lula came from the industrial field, so the weight of the industrial workers was, in a way, dominant. Now, it's still very important, of course, but it is also important to look at the indigenous people, to the people of Black origin who live in communities of Black people, and which, although already this was happening in the past, it will be much more in the future.
Okay, talk to me about oil development. Lula says that Brazil still needs oil for a while, and he said that he would not join an anti-oil bloc as proposed by Colombia's newly elected progressive president, Gustavo Petro. It looks like you're planning to continue to rely on oil despite the climate crisis. How does Lula intend to reverse environmental damage from the Bolsonaro years while backing fossil fuels?
Well, I think these, to a large extent, will depend on decisions of the international community itself. I think if we find a consensus on how much oil, fossil oil can be used, if we substitute fossil oil by other sources of energy, like, for instance, green hydrogen or whatever, we certainly follow the rules. And we'll contribute to the rules that limit carbon. I myself am a member of a committee about climate overshooting. So this is a concern that is very much present. How exactly it will be, I cannot say, but I'm sure that we'll work on the direction of the diminution of the relative role of fossil fuel. But this is not only a problem of Brazil. This is a problem in the United States as well, and to your other friends, to the United States friends on other parts of the world.
You've talked about being a career diplomat. In the early 2000s, you served as Lula's foreign affairs minister. And one of the things that you attempted to do was to strengthen Brazil's integration with its South American neighbors. Right now, many are saying we're living through a new pink tide with recently elected progressive governments in places like Colombia and Chile. If Lula is elected, what role do you see Brazil playing in those regional integration efforts, and what are your goals?
Well, let me tell you, I see the world today, well, there are many other aspects that should be considered, but let me say, I see the world today to be in the middle of some kind of dilemma between multipolarity or Cold War. Cold War sometimes became even hot war, as it is now. So, and we think that integration of South America, because South America is a continent of peace. Latin America and Caribbean in general is an area of peace. So the more we integrate, the more our voice will be heard internationally, and that will contribute not only to our in our favor, but to the peace in the world. I think it's very important that the Latin American and Caribbean will have their voice. In order for that to happen, we have to be more integrated, because if each country wants just to have their advantage of having a bigger quota from the United States or bigger investment from China without taking into account the whole continent, I think we'll lose. We'll lose. I mean, Brazil is a bigger country, but even Brazil is not big enough to discuss with the United States, to discuss with China, to discuss with the European Union. So that's one reason why integration is so important.
20 years after his first election, progressives are once again looking to Lula, who is now 76 years old. It would appear that no one on the left has been able to match his popularity.
He'll be 77.
70, even more so. A 77.
No, I'm just.
No, it's 77 years old. And no one seems to be able to match his pop.
Oh, I don't find it. I am 80. Okay. And President Biden is 77 or 79.
79, yeah.
I think.
But this is the problem when the
patterns have changed.
In a way, but one of the patterns, it seems, is that the left is looking to people for help and support without a clear successorship. When Lula leaves office, there's a parliamentary coup. There's major political turmoil. It seems to me that we often are centering our progressive movements around individuals rather than values. And so then when that person leaves, it's hard to find successorship. We're seeing the same problem again in the United States. What do you say to people who ask the question, what is the plan for a progressive political future in Brazil? What is the plan for successorship that extends beyond Lula?
Well, I don't know, but there are several. I mean, I could name several people in Brazilian politics, including the possible future governor of São Paulo, but there are many other people who would be qualified and who are much younger, who are in their 40s, early 50s. I mean, in order to reconcile and reconstruct the views of a real democratic society, with a fair society, with social justice and so on, maybe at this point we need experience more than inventiveness. Maybe 4 years from now, it will be the other way around. But, you know, as you like to say, we cross that bridge when we get to it. Our problem now is restoring peace, internal peace in our country, restoring humanity, restoring civilization, restoring good racial policies, good policies for women. So that's what we need now. And that's what made possible this alliance, which includes the traditional center-right people and the more left-wing people. You will have people who were former guerrilla, and you have people who were bankers, all of them supporting Lula now. Because, I mean, it's a question of salvation, of national salvation. I'm speaking frankly. You know, I'm an old guy, so I have seen many things. I mean, if Bolsonaro, I don't think he will win. I don't think there's any chance. But if he would win, Brazil, as we understand it, will no longer exist.
Mr. Amorim, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you very much.
All right, that is our show. UpFront, we'll be back next week.